Just in case you don't know who Alex is, which would be rude of you, I'm going to tell you that she is a journalist and a podcaster, a TV host, a columnist, and a cultural commentator. Back when she was at Auckland University studying film, television, and media, plus sociology, she got an A+ for her essay about Katy Perry's documentary. I think it's something that should be in every explanation of who she is. Alex is senior writer at The Spinoff, and I was lucky enough to work with Alex on the iconic, I'm calling it that, feminist podcast On the Rag from 2016 until COVID. So I'm going to start off, Alex. I want you to share with us your most outstanding experiences of sexism.
Oh my gosh.
Just
big question, Michelle.
Yeah, the stuff that they've said, and maybe what you wish you'd said back at the time.
Well, this is why I brought this whole notepad is full of them. And we've only got 20 minutes, so we've got a lot to get through. I mean, I thought I'd start with, and I'm sure you have some examples here, is encountering sexism through your work. And I'm not talking about my workplace necessarily, but I am a journalist and an online writer, and I spent a lot of time writing about feminism, especially when I just started and I was really young. I was 23, but I looked like I was 12, and that was a big problem for a lot of men. So when I was writing more sort of spicy feminist takes, I would get some really interesting feedback. Like, men would say, oh, she's just angry because she's got a sandy vagina. Which wasn't true.
It's a kind of a weirdly specific
It's gynecological. It's gynecological.
Yeah.
It's too much. Or like just that I'm kind of jealous, or that I'm like angry I'm not prettier, or all this sort of stuff. We ended up turning the comments off on our website, as a lot of news outlets have since. But yeah, it was always those sorts of comments that really got to me, especially as a young writer, especially when you're writing about women's issues that you really care about, and you suddenly get this barrage of hate. But I'm sure you've experienced that too in your line of work.
So one of the things that I find really comforting is that I'm quite busy, and sometimes I don't have time to hate myself as much as I should. Or be self-critical, or be filled with self-doubt. So I have Twitter. I'm still on Twitter. You're not on Twitter anymore. I know, I'm still on Twitter. Because sometimes I run out of time to think of shit things to say to myself in my head. So I go to Twitter, where I get self-hating handmaiden, puppet of the white male left, I'm ugly, I'm fat, I'm old, I have never had a decent relationship with a man. I've got daddy issues. So any of that stuff. And, that's when I've just posted my Wordle score. So, so I find that handy.
You get that. And I mean, I've had a lot. My most recent one, and this was from someone that I love very much in my extended family, who I was talking about chopping wood. I've recently moved to Christchurch, and I love the fire, and I was just talking about it, and she was like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. And I was like, why? And she's like, that's a boy's job. And I was like, oh, this is old school. Like, I didn't realize we had this still going.
How old is the person who said that to you?
In her 60s.
Okay. Oh, so I'm in my 60s. I would not say a thing like that.
Yeah, and that was just one of those kind of classic ones. I just let it slide in the moment, because I was like, that's all good. And I just made sure to chop lots of wood every day following that interaction, like as a sort of defiance.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's everywhere, right? Like, this is the thing. It's hard to boil down. I was thinking about I had a terrible experience happen to me last year where I was subjected to indecent exposure at a mall in Auckland. A man was masturbating in front of me behind a pillar, and it was a horrible experience. And I took it to the police because, sadly, it's happened to me before. And it was one of those things where you go, okay, next time, unfortunately, and there was a next time, here's what I'll do. And I was quite impressed with the process, but what shocked me was the reaction of people when I told them. Every woman I told, horrified, empathetic, had a story of their own immediately to tell. Every man I told, without fail, raincoat, flasher joke, like across the board. And I thought it was really interesting how it was like, the difference in the reaction to that, and how much it said about the perspectives that you bring to the world, and that for these men, a penis in public is like a funny joke. For women, it's violence,
and
it's
a threat. It's violence.
Fear.
Yeah.
So that was something I thought was interesting, where it's not necessarily like overt sexism, kind of your hashtag everyday sexism comment, but just the differentiation in the responses I found fascinating.
Do you have moments where people just assume that you're not the person who is doing the job? Like, for example, so I have experiences of being in green rooms overseas for comedy shows, and they go, "Whose girlfriend are you?" as opposed to, "Are you second on the bill?"
Yeah, I do get that a lot. And I think it's because also I've got a unisex name. And when you have an androgynous name, people assume you're a man if they don't know any better or any different. So still probably like once every few weeks, because, I'm a journalist, I'm emailing lots of people kind of cold or texting or messaging, and I'll have these whole interactions with someone that seem really positive, and then I'll meet them or I'll talk to them on the phone, and something changes, and I don't know what it is necessarily. It's sort of like a factory reset behind the eyes when they realize they're like, "Oh, you're a woman, Alex. This is not what I was expecting." And it's always interested me that I'm like, what changed there? Like what have you shifted in your perception of me or our interactions or my qualifications or, and I had that even when I worked in like hospitality or when I worked managing a cinema, and the techies would come and be like, "I'm here to talk to the manager, Alex." And I'm like, "Yeah, hi." And they're like, No, the manager." I'm like, "Yeah, Alex, hello." And they're like, No, the manager, Alex."
Yeah, clues in the name, it's manager.
Exactly.
I know, right?
Exactly. So no, that's something that I always still encounter.
That's a really interesting thing, that default position, Alex is a man. I'm interested that you did a little experiment where was it on Instagram, you set up a profile as a 13-year-old boy?
Oh, yeah, it sounds really bad when you put it like that. This was, so I've gone off social media, which was, not necessarily strictly related to sexism, but just I was sick of hating myself as a result of these platforms. But I still have to dabble for work. I'm very interested in the internet and social media. And when a lovely man called Andrew Tate started coming up in the public conversation.
Terrific.
Now, if you don't know who Andrew Tate is, he's a former kickboxer, reality star turned nightmare online kind of meninist guy who makes a lot of content for young men, all about how women should be property, how women shouldn't drive, how women who have had too much sex are worthless, like really awful, extreme sexist views. Ironically, he's now being charged for human trafficking and all these awful things in Romania. But when he first emerged, there was a lot of concern in local schools, principals in Auckland saying, young men are watching Andrew Tate, and he is getting out there into the consciousness of our young people. So I set up a TikTok account as a 13-year-old boy, and I said, I like sport, and I like comedy, and I like life hacks, or whatever, really innocuous. And within moments of scrolling, I had Andrew Tate in my feed, and it just made me think like, oh man, this algorithm has a lot to answer for.
Yeah.
It was, and they were the extreme Andrew Tate, views and opinions, and it was there like instantaneously.
So we thought that social media was going to be this really democratic place where everybody would be on a level playing field, where the voiceless could have a voice, the vulnerable would be safe. It hasn't really turned out that way.
No, it's funny, hey? It's almost like under the patriarchy and capitalism, we just can't have nice things.
It's almost like when they set the algorithms, they decided to lead us towards things that cause the most debate as opposed to the most it's the fizzy, angry things that rise to the top of any of the, on Twitter, on Instagram. It's the arguments, and Facebook, it's the arguments that get the attention, it's not even positive engagement that gets attention.
No, and I think there's a lot to be said for the fact that all of these platforms are run by cis white billionaire men who don't seem to have a strong interest in the experience of anyone else who doesn't really look like them or have their kind of lives. And we see this, time and time again with extremist content, taking ages once it gets flagged to be removed, or content of, women showing their periods gets taken down like that. Breastfeeding gets removed really quickly. And so, just the more I see what's going on, the more I'm like, uh-oh.
Yeah. I'm trying not to lose faith in it, but I don't know if I'm, barbed wire canoeing it, or not. But I also want to observe that sexism existed before social media.
Yeah.
I know. It's been around for ages.
That's what I've heard.
So I want to talk about Tory Whānau, Kitty Allen, Jacinda Ardern. Regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, I feel like you can see there's a double standard being applied to women, and particularly to women of colour. Mm-hmm. Let's discuss that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because many years ago, like when I finished university, I did a summer research project with the politics department looking at women in leadership. And at that point, there was Julia Gillard, there was Helen Clark, Jenny Shipley, Thatcher. And but it was interesting looking at it was kind of a close reading of the media coverage and how much of it was centered around appearance, clothing, family, childbearing, their relationships. I mean, we can remember the Helen Clark, endless conversation and all of that. And it just appears that on one hand, it's wonderful. We've had more women getting into leadership roles than ever before. But yes, like you say, can't ignore those intersections of ethnicity and age and how all of that impacts it.
What are the signs to look out for that show us that we are moving towards equity and equality? What have we got left to do? And is there a key thing that we need to get done to smash the patriarchy? I know it's
a big
easy.
question.
It's really simple. This is really easy. You should be able to answer this. No trouble.
Well, I think there's a lot of things to be worried about.
Yeah.
I think we should keep eyes on what's happening in the US and conservatism and, reproductive rights being rolled back across the world and all this sort of stuff. I know New Zealand is a relatively progressive country in that regard.
Yeah.
We can look to legislation, we can look to abortion being taken out of the Crimes Act and all of these things as huge measurable wins. The Women's World Cup is a huge win. The fact that events like this exist. Period equity, I think, is something that we can be really proud of, that we're working towards free products in schools, and even, the football ferns rallying against wearing white shorts is like a tremendous thing that we're even talking about this sort of stuff in public now. So I think there's lots to be excited about. In terms of how to fix it all, I'm very much of the opinion, not to bring it back again to social media, but there is something that I worry about that I think people conflate a like or a share with real activism, and that there's this sort of, I think it's really useful that social media is a great platform for raising consciousness and having conversations and experiencing, other people's way of life. But I think there's also real action to be taken, and sometimes it's stuff as boring as, if you're in the position to do so, donate money, to the causes, to the organisations, to Women's Refuge, to places like that are doing the community work on the ground, contacting your MPs, petitions, all that kind of stuff I think is still really, really useful. And I just think sometimes it can feel like you're doing stuff with a like, or a share. And sometimes you are, but just remembering the real world of it all, I think is really important.
And I think that one of those, be in it, actually do stuff. You taking the case against the man who I was going to say sexually assault. That's not quite what happened, but the man who exposed himself to you. If you can, if it's a situation where you do feel safe enough to do that, then speaking up is really important, right, in those scenarios?
Yeah, and that's not always possible, and I completely understand why people would be wary of the police system and the justice system and all of that, but even talking about it is really, really useful. I found actually through the experience of going through that and talking about it, I got, a story out of it, and I got lots and lots of stories back from women everywhere saying, this has sort of been treated as a punchline, for a really long time, but it had a huge impact on me. It kind of transformed my life, negatively. And I think that's where the conversation needs to be. We need to share these experiences for better or worse, and there is strength in that.
Absolutely. I always think it comes back to us finding connection by telling each other our stories. The last question that we ask everybody in this series of events is, what is the piece of advice you would give to your younger self to help them thrive as a wahine?
It's a big question. And when I thought about this, I thought about myself when I was younger, and it reminded me of, I was trying to think about when I discovered sexism, when it first kind of reared its head into my life. And there was this example of, I went to an all-girls school. I lived with my mum as a teenager. I didn't really have any male friends. I didn't really have many interactions with men. And it was on the way to my fifth form after ball. And when you're a kid and you dream of the ball and you're like, I'm going to get dressed up and I'm going to have a great time with my friends and maybe there'll be like a cute Prince Charming, because that's what you're raised to think. Ridiculous. I don't know what I was thinking. But on the bus to the after ball, we got surrounded by a group of young men chanting, "Tits out for the boys, tits out for the boys." A classic New Zealand song.
Was that a Split Enz song or is it Dave Dobbin? I can't remember.
It charts hugely. It's a Christmas #1. And I remember being horrified and everything shifting before my eyes and realizing the world is really different to what I thought. And maybe the way that me and my friends are perceived is so different to what we thought we were. And so I always think of that situation and that person and how kind of scared I felt and fearful. And so I would just say, speak up and trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If a situation feels like you're being undermined or ignored or not taken seriously, you probably are. And don't forget these things. I know it's hard to call them out in the moment. And my advice, an easy way to call stuff out would just be, that's a weird thing to say. I find that really useful in conversation.
Great.
But yeah, I would just say, trust your gut and speak up.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid. Don't be afraid.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
Even though it feels horrible.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I love it. That is all we have time for, which breaks my heart. So we're going to go and continue this conversation in the green room, so come through if you'd like to. Another round of applause for the wonderful
Thank you, Michelle.
Casey. Thank you.